June 19, 1944. 1:32 p.m. Pacific Ocean. A torpedo slams into the starboard hull of the carrier Taiho, Japan's newest, proudest warship. Steel screams. Aviation fuel ruptures. 6 hours later, a single spark ignites the gasoline vapor flooding her compartments. The explosion tears the 30,000-ton carrier apart from bow to stern. Flight decks buckle upward. Bulkheads collapse inward. 1,272 men are incinerated, drowned, or crushed in the burning steel coffin she has become. By 7:28 p.m., Taiho slips beneath the waves, stern first taking with her 32 months of construction, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and any remaining illusion that Japan could win this war. Standing on the bridge of the cruiser, Haguro Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa watches the smoke pillar rise from the ocean where his flagship died. He says nothing. He cannot say anything. Because 3 weeks earlier, he read a classified intelligence report that already told him this moment was coming. Not this exact carrier, not this exact day, but this outcome, this inevitability, this mathematical certainty of defeat. The report contained one number that broke him: 24. 24 American Essex-class fleet carriers either commissioned or under construction. 24 identical ships, built in less than 3 years. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Become part of our community of history lovers today. But this story doesn't begin with admirals or aircraft carriers. It begins with a 47-year-old welder named Clarence Clancy Haggerty, standing in a cold Virginia shipyard in April 1941, holding a torch he barely knew how to use. 8 months later, Clancy and 10,000 workers like him would build the ship that doomed the Japanese Empire. They didn't know it. Nobody knew it. Because the idea they were about to execute was considered impossible, ridiculous, and according to traditional naval architects, completely insane. By December 1941, the United States Navy faced a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Pearl Harbor had not just damaged the Pacific Fleet, it had revealed something far more terrifying. Japan had built the finest carrier force in human history, and America had nothing to match it. 6 Japanese fleet carriers had launched the Pearl Harbor strike. 6. All modern, all battle-tested, all operating with pilots who had trained for 2 full years before their first combat mission. Japanese naval aviators accumulated 500 flight hours before joining fleet squadrons. Their aircraft, the legendary A-6M0 fighter, outperformed everything in the American inventory. Their torpedo bombers carried weapons that actually worked, unlike the defective Mark 13 torpedoes plaguing American forces. The numbers told a story of impending doom. America had 4 operational fleet carriers in the Pacific. Japan had 6. America's carriers, the Lexington-class and Yorktown-class ships, were aging designs with known weaknesses. Japan's carriers were newer, faster, and carried more aircraft. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific belonged to Japan. Japanese carriers supported the conquest of the Philippines. They crushed Allied resistance in the Dutch East Indies. They drove deep into the Indian Ocean, sinking British carriers and battleships at will. Every operation succeeded. Every battle was won. Then came the price. May 1942. Coral Sea. The carrier Lexington sunk. June 1942. Midway. A miracle victory cost the carrier Yorktown. By September, Wasp was torpedoed and lost. By October, Hornet was sunk at Santa Cruz. In 10 months of combat, the United States Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers from a starting force of 7. By November 1942, America had exactly 2 operational fleet carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean. Enterprise badly damaged fighting on with patched-together repairs. Saratoga recovering from torpedo damage. 2 carriers. Against a Japanese force that still operated 6. The mathematics of catastrophe was simple. At current loss rates, America would have 0 carriers within 6 months. The Pacific would be lost. Hawaii would be vulnerable. Australia would fall. The war would be over before American industry could even respond. Traditional shipbuilding offered no solution. A fleet carrier required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. The Yorktown class had taken 38 months on average. By the time replacements arrived, the war would already be lost. Naval architects told Congress what they knew to be true. There was no way to build carriers fast enough to replace combat losses. But everything was about to change because of a man nobody noticed working in a shipyard. Nobody thought important. Executing an idea that established naval engineers had rejected, ridiculed, and called professionally irresponsible. Clarence Haggerty was not supposed to be building warships. Born in 1894 in Roanoke, Virginia, the son of a railroad mechanic, he had spent 23 years welding boilers, water tanks, and locomotive parts for the Norfolk and Western Railway. He never finished high school. He never read a naval architecture textbook. He had never seen the ocean until he was 31 years old. What Clancy possessed was something else entirely. He understood metal. He understood how steel behaved when heated, when stressed, when cooled too fast, when welded by tired men working in the dark. He could look at a seam and know if it would hold. He could feel a flaw through his glove before any inspector spotted it. In March 1941, the Norfolk and Western Railway laid off 300 workers as wartime priorities shifted resources to ship construction. Clancy, 46 years old with a wife and 2 daughters at home, walked 62 miles to Newport News, Virginia, looking for work. He arrived at the gates of Newport News Shipbuilding with $7 in his pocket and blistered feet. He was hired the same day, not because anyone recognized his skill, because Newport News was desperate. The shipyard had just received an order from the United States Navy that exceeded anything they had ever attempted. Build a new class of fleet carrier. Build it fast. Build it using methods nobody had ever tried before. And then build 23 more, just like it. Clancy was assigned to a project the workers called simply Hull 354. Officially, she was the USS Essex lead ship of a new carrier class designed by men who had thrown out the entire rulebook of naval construction. On his second day, Clancy stood in a building 500 feet long, watching something that didn't make sense. Workers were not building a ship. They were building pieces of a ship. Massive sections of flight deck, complete propulsion modules, pre-assembled gun mounts, all being constructed separately in different buildings by different teams. His foreman, a man named Eddie Marston, explained it in 3 sentences. "We're not building this thing the old way, Clancy. We're building it like a Ford. Pieces here, pieces there, slap it together at the end." Clancy stared. What Marston was describing violated every principle of warship construction taught for the previous 100 years. And one fateful night in October 1941, working alone on a flight deck section under emergency lighting, Clancy would discover the flaw in this method that almost killed the entire program. The idea at the heart of the Essex-class program was, by traditional standards, completely insane. Senior naval architects in Washington had argued against it for years. Some called it reckless. Others called it amateur. One retired admiral testified before Congress that adopting these methods would produce ships that would split apart in heavy seas like rotten driftwood. The idea was simple to explain and terrifying to execute. Build warships the way Henry Ford built automobiles. Think about how a car gets built. Engines are assembled in one factory, transmissions in another. Body panels are stamped out by the 1,000 in a third facility. Workers don't custom fit each piece. They install standardized components designed to work together. The car comes together on a moving assembly line. Workers do one job again and again until they can do it faster than a master craftsman. Now apply that to a 27,000-ton warship carrying 90 aircraft and 1,400 crewmen. That was the impossible thing the Essex program proposed. Prefabricate flight deck sections in dedicated buildings, each section weighing hundreds of tons. Build complete propulsion modules in machine shops with turbines, boilers, and piping already connected and tested. Construct hangar deck assemblies on their sides in separate facilities. Then lift everything into the hull with massive cranes and weld it together. Naval architects across the world considered this approach forbidden for one fundamental reason. Warships flex. They twist. They endure forces no automobile would ever experience. A welded seam between two prefabricated sections might pass inspection in dry dock, then crack open in heavy seas off Iwo Jima doom 1,700 sailors to drowning. Traditional shipbuilding used skilled craftsmen to custom fit every joint, every plate, every piece. It was slow. It was expensive. It worked. The Essex program threw all of that away. Why? Because traditional methods produced one carrier every 38 months. The math demanded something different. If America lost carriers at the rate experienced through 1942, traditional construction would deliver replacements after the war was already lost. The reaction from the established naval engineering community was savage. Articles in trade publications mocked the program. Senior officers wrote private memos predicting catastrophe. One captain at the Bureau of Construction and Repair called the modular approach an act of national suicide masquerading as innovation. But one man overruled them all. Rear Admiral Robert Carney, working with civilian engineers at Newport News, made the decision. The risk of building carriers the new way was real. The certainty of losing the war the old way was absolute. He chose the risk. By April 1941, when Clancy Haggerty walked through the gates of Newport News, USS Essex was already taking shape. Not as a ship, as a series of components scattered across the largest shipyard in America. And nobody, not the engineers, not the admirals, not the workers themselves, knew if the pieces would actually fit together. The first test was scheduled for October 1941. The result of that test would determine whether America could survive the coming war. Clancy Haggerty, the railroad welder from Roanoke, would be standing in the middle of it. The trial run happened on the night of October 14, 1941. The largest crane in Newport News, capable of lifting 400 tons, was positioned over the dry dock, where hull 354 lay partially assembled. A flight deck section measuring 120 feet by 90 feet, weighing 380 tons, hung from the crane in the cold Virginia darkness. The plan was straightforward. Lower the section onto the carrier hull. Workers would weld it into place along seams already prepared. If the section fit within tolerances of 1/8 of an inch, the modular approach worked. If it didn't fit, 10 months of work was wasted, and America's last hope for rapid carrier production was dead. Clancy was on the deck below part of the welding team that would secure the section. He stood with 7 other men watching the massive steel structure descend through floodlights. The crane operator, a man named Jim Riley, controlled the descent inch by inch. At 11:47 p.m., the deck section made contact with the hull. The first measurement showed a gap of 7/8 of an inch on the port side. Way out of tolerance. Engineers shouted contradictory orders. Some demanded the section be lifted off and remachined. Others demanded the gap be filled with welded patches. Either solution would set the program back by months. Newspapers were already running stories questioning the carrier program. Congressional skeptics were waiting for proof that the modular approach had failed. Clancy Haggerty walked over to the gap, knelt down, and pulled off his welding glove. He ran his bare hand along the seam. The men around him went silent. He stood up and spoke directly to the chief engineer, a Naval Academy graduate named Commander Thomas Whitfield. "It ain't the section. The hull's contracted from the cold. Heat the bulkhead frame for 40 minutes. She'll come right in." Whitfield stared at the railroad welder, telling him how to align a 380-ton flight deck section. He had 2 choices. Trust the engineering staff who said lift the section and remachine, or trust this unknown welder who had never built a ship in his life. He ordered the bulkhead heated. At 1:23 a.m. on October 15, 1941, the gap closed to 1/16 of an inch, within tolerance. The flight deck section settled into position. Welders began securing it within the hour. By dawn, the most ambitious modular construction in naval history had passed its first critical test. The Essex-class program was alive, and the impossible was about to become routine. USS Essex was launched on July 31, 1942, 15 months after her keel was laid. She was commissioned on December 31st, 1942, 20 months from start to operational status. Traditional construction would have required 38 months. The Essex program had cut construction time nearly in half, but Essex was just one ship. The Navy had authorized 23 more. And while Newport News refined its methods, 4 other shipyards were learning to apply the same techniques. Bethlehem Steel in Quincy, Massachusetts, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, New York Naval Shipyard, 5 yards. Building identical carriers. Using identical methods. Sharing improvements instantly. By August 1943, the Pacific Fleet had received 4 new Essex-class carriers. By December 1943, 11 were in service. 11 new fleet carriers commissioned in 12 months, while Japan commissioned exactly 1. Japanese intelligence officers in Tokyo could not believe the reports they were receiving. Reconnaissance photographs showed multiple identical American carriers at Pearl Harbor. Radio intercepts mentioned ship names that intelligence files insisted had been sunk months earlier. Yorktown sunk at Midway. Wasp sunk near Guadalcanal. Hornet sunk at Santa Cruz. And yet here were operational carriers with those exact names conducting strikes against Japanese positions. The Americans were not just replacing losses. They were resurrecting their dead. In a Tokyo conference room in February 1944, a young naval intelligence officer named Lieutenant Commander Akira Sasaki briefed senior staff on his analysis of American carrier construction. He projected American production at 15 Essex-class carriers operational by mid-1944. His superiors dismissed the estimate as alarmist. Such production rates were physically impossible. Sasaki's estimate was wrong. The Americans had 17. But here is what nobody on either side fully understood yet. The Essex-class carriers being launched in American shipyards were not just numerous. They were superior to anything Japan had ever built. They carried more aircraft. They had better radar, better armor, better damage control, better anti-aircraft weapons. By the time Japan would face them in combat, the disparity would not be 8-1. It would be closer to 15-1 in actual combat power. And in Part 2, we will see what happens when those carriers finally meet the Imperial Japanese Navy in open battle. We will witness the largest carrier action in human history. We will follow Clancy Haggerty as his welded seams are tested by Japanese torpedoes off the Mariana Islands. We will see a single morning of combat in which 300 Japanese aircraft fall from the sky, 3 Japanese carriers vanish beneath the Pacific, and 1 Japanese admiral standing on a burning bridge finally understands what those 24 numbers in the intelligence report actually meant. Could one hidden flaw in the Essex design still hand victory to Japan? Lieutenant Commander Sasaki believed he had found it. And in March 1944, he was about to convince Vice Admiral Ozawa to bet everything on exploiting it. In Part 1, a 47-year-old railroad welder named Clarence Haggerty walked into Newport News shipyard with $7 in his pocket and accidentally saved the modular construction of USS Essex on a freezing October night in 1941. The flight deck section settled into place. The impossible became possible. America had its method to build carriers in 20 months instead of 38. But convincing the United States Navy to bet the entire Pacific War on this method was a battle Clancy and his engineers had not yet won. Because waiting for them in Washington was a man who had spent 41 years building warships the old way. A man who controlled the fate of every contract, every steel allocation, every welding rod in America. A man who hated the Essex program with the fury of an entire profession humiliated. His name was Vice Admiral Samuel Murray Robinson. And in March 1942, he was about to do everything in his power to strangle the program in its cradle. And this is where things got worse. Vice Admiral Robinson commanded the Office of Procurement and Material, 63 years old, Naval Academy class of 1903. He had supervised the construction of 14 capital ships across his career, including the legendary battleships Arizona and Pennsylvania. He believed warships were built by craftsmen, not by assembly line workers. He believed welded seams and load-bearing structures were a criminal shortcut. And he believed Newport News had sold the Navy a fraud. On March 11, 1942, Robinson convened an emergency review board in Washington. The Battle of the Java Sea had just ended in catastrophic Allied defeat. 5 cruisers and 10 destroyers lost. The Pacific was hemorrhaging ships, and Robinson used the disaster as ammunition. "We cannot afford experiments," he told the assembled officers. "Every Essex hull commits steel that could build 3 destroyers. 3 destroyers that fight tomorrow, not carriers that may or may not float in 1943. Commander Thomas Whitfield, the engineer who had trusted Clancy Haggerty's instinct on that October night, stood up to defend the program. He brought stress test data, welding inspection reports, photographs of the Essex flight deck performing exactly as designed. Robinson dismissed all of it. "Paper commander, I have buried sailors because of paper." He demanded the next 20 Essex contracts be canceled and reallocated to traditional construction. He recommended Whitfield's reassignment to a desk in Norfolk. He suggested that civilian welders without naval engineering credentials, men like Clancy Haggerty, should be removed from positions of structural responsibility. The room went silent. Whitfield was 42 years old. He had a wife, 3 children, and a career that Robinson could end with a single signature. He sat down. The political situation outside the room was even worse. Newspapers were printing daily casualty lists from the Pacific. Senator Harry Truman's investigative committee was hunting wartime contractors for fraud. Skeptical congressmen demanded explanations for why Newport News was charging the taxpayer for ships that did not yet exist. Robinson had allies on Capitol Hill in the press and inside the Navy itself. Within 72 hours of the review board, Whitfield received written notification of probable reassignment. Clancy Haggerty was told his security clearance was under review. 6 other engineers received similar warnings. The modular program was being suffocated through paperwork. But then Whitfield found an unexpected ally. His name was Rear Admiral Ben Morrell, 50 years old, chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, the man who had created the Seabees, the legendary Navy construction battalions that built airfields under enemy fire. Morrell understood something Robinson did not. The Pacific War would be won by industrial tempo, not by traditional craftsmanship. On March 19, 1942, Whitfield met Morrell in a private dining room at the Army-Navy Club in Washington. He brought a single roll of blueprints. He brought 1 welder. Clancy Haggerty, in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too small, sat at a table with a man who commanded 100,000 workers. Morrell asked one question. "If I give you a hull and 90 days, what can you prove to me?" Clancy spoke before Whitfield could answer. "Sir, give me 1 section of flight deck and a hydraulic press. I'll show you steel that bends before it breaks. The old way splits at the rivets. Our way bends and holds. I can prove it in 11 days. Morrell stared at the welder. Then he laughed, the first laugh anyone had heard from Ben Morrell in a month. 11 days, Mr. Haggerty. The Bureau of Construction will send observers. Robinson will send observers. If your section fails, you are finished. If it survives, I will personally take this fight to Secretary Knox. The conditions were brutal. The test would be conducted at the Naval Engineering Experiment Station in Annapolis. A flight deck section 60 feet by 40 feet modular construction. It would be subjected to controlled stress tests, simulating wave impact torpedo concussion and aircraft landing forces. Robinson would be present. 6 skeptical naval architects would be present. Press would be excluded. If the section cracked along any welded seam under loads below specification, the entire Essex program would be terminated within 30 days. Clancy and Whitfield had 11 days to fabricate transport and prepare a section that would normally take 3 weeks. They worked 17-hour shifts. They smuggled welding equipment from Newport News on freight trains. They paid out of pocket for materials when paperwork moved too slowly. The test day arrived. April 2, 1942. Annapolis, Maryland. And if it failed, the carriers America needed to win the Pacific would never be built. The morning was overcast and cold, 43 degrees, wind from the northwest at 12 knots. The test stand at the Naval Engineering Experiment Station was an open concrete platform 200 feet long, ringed by hydraulic actuators, capable of generating impacts of up to 40 tons. The flight deck section sat at the center of the platform. 60 feet by 40 feet, 3 layers of welded steel plate, constructed using the same modular techniques being applied to USS Essex. Vice Admiral Robinson arrived at 8:47 a.m. with his entourage of 6 naval architects. He wore his service blues. He carried a leather portfolio filled with stress calculations he intended to use to demolish the demonstration after it failed. Rear Admiral Moriel arrived at 8:58 a.m. Whitfield, 3 engineers, and Clancy Haggerty in welder's coveralls. He had refused to wear anything else. The first test was scheduled for 9 a.m. A vertical impact load of 15 tons, simulating a Hellcat fighter making a hard landing. Standard specification required the deck to absorb the load without permanent deformation exceeding 1/4 inch. The hydraulic ram descended. Steel groaned. The deck section dipped, held, and returned to position. Measurement showed deformation of 3/16 of an inch, within tolerance. Robinson made a note. Test 2. Lateral impact load. 22 tons applied across the deck surface, simulating a wave broadside in heavy seas. The section flexed visibly. One of the naval architects audibly gasped, but the welded seams held. No cracking, no failure. Test 3. The critical test. Concussive shock, simulating a torpedo detonation against the hull below. 40 tons of impact energy delivered in 0.3 seconds. This was the test that traditional naval architects insisted would split modular construction along its welded seams. Clancy stood at the edge of the platform. He had welded 14 of the seams on this section himself. He knew which ones he trusted. He knew which one he was worried about. The starboard seam second from the forward edge, where 2 plates had joined at temperatures slightly below specification, because the weather had turned cold during fabrication. The hydraulic ram fired. The impact was loud enough to shake windows 200 yards away. The deck section jumped 6 inches off its supports. It crashed back down. Steel rang. For 4 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the inspection team rushed forward. They examined every seam under bright lamps and magnifying glasses. The lead inspector, a naval architect named George Sullivan, who had publicly criticized the modular method, walked the entire perimeter of the section twice. He stopped. He knelt. He ran his hand along the starboard seam, second from the forward edge. He stood up. He turned to Vice Admiral Robinson. "Sir, there is no failure, no cracking, no measurable deformation along any welded seam. The section has survived a load equivalent to a torpedo strike." Robinson said nothing. He stared at the deck section as if it had personally betrayed him. The 4th and 5th tests were scheduled, but no longer necessary. Moriel ordered them conducted anyway. Both passed. Margins exceeded specification. The starboard seam, the one Clancy had worried about, showed deformation of 1/32 of an inch, less than the diameter of a sewing needle. By 11:34 a.m., the demonstration was complete. The numbers were undeniable. Modular welded construction had matched or exceeded traditional riveted construction across every measurable category. Construction time, 20 months versus 38 months. Material weight, 7% lighter. Stress tolerance equivalent or superior on 4 of 6 tests. Robinson closed his portfolio. He walked to Whitfield. He extended his hand. "Commander, I withdraw my objections. May God help us if I was wrong." Within 48 hours, the Office of Procurement reversed its position. The next 20 Essex hulls were authorized for accelerated construction. Whitfield's reassignment was canceled. Clancy Haggerty's security clearance was upgraded to permit him to train other welders across multiple shipyards. But success in a controlled test was one thing. Building 24 identical carriers simultaneously at 5 different shipyards with workers who had never welded warship steel before was something else entirely. The mass production phase began in May 1942. Newport News Bethlehem Steel, Quincy, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard and New York Naval Shipyard received authorization to begin construction immediately. Each yard needed thousands of new workers, welders, pipe fitters, electricians, riveters being retrained, women entering shipyards for the first time, black workers brought up from the South. The logistical scale was staggering. Newport News alone hired 31,000 new workers between June 1942 and December 1943. Steel allocations had to be coordinated across 43 different supplier mills. Prefabricated turbines came from General Electric in Schenectady, boilers from Babcock and Wilcox in Ohio, aircraft elevators from Otis in Yonkers. Resistance came from inside the Navy itself. Senior officers at older shipyards refused to adopt the new methods. They insisted modular construction was a Newport News specialty that could not be replicated elsewhere. They were wrong, but their resistance cost weeks of construction time on 3 different hulls. Clancy Haggerty spent the next 18 months traveling between shipyards. He trained welders in Quincy. He fixed alignment problems in Philadelphia. He testified before a congressional subcommittee in November 1942 about why a railroad welder from Roanoke understood naval engineering better than the Bureau of Construction. The first results from combat were undeniable. USS Essex commissioned December 31, 1942. USS Lexington, the second one replacing the carrier, sunk at Coral Sea, commissioned February 17, 1943. USS Yorktown, the second one replacing the carrier sunk at Midway, commissioned April 15, 1943. USS Bunker Hill, May 24, 1943. USS Intrepid, August 16, 1943. By the end of 1943, 11 Essex-class carriers were operational. Japanese reconnaissance pilots reported encountering carriers with names that should have been on the bottom of the ocean. Imperial Navy intelligence officers in Tokyo could not reconcile the reports with their estimates. Their projections had assumed American production rates of 3 to 4 fleet carriers per year. The Americans were producing 11. But as Essex-class carriers began appearing in Pacific combat, 2 new threats emerged. One came from inside the program. A young Japanese intelligence officer named Lieutenant Commander Akira Sasaki, working in a basement office in Tokyo, had identified what he believed was a fatal flaw in the Essex design. A vulnerability in the aviation fuel storage system that, if exploited correctly, could turn each carrier into a floating bomb waiting to detonate. The other threat was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's mobile fleet, who in March 1944 received Sasaki's analysis and began planning the largest carrier ambush in naval history. In Part 3, Sasaki's flaw becomes real. 2 American carriers will burn. Clancy Haggerty will be summoned to the Pacific to investigate the wreckage. And the war the Americans thought they were winning will suddenly become the war they might lose. The real fight was just beginning. In Part 1, a railroad welder named Clarence Haggerty saved the Essex flight deck on a freezing October night. In Part 2, a stress test in Annapolis broke Vice Admiral Robinson's resistance and unleashed mass production across 5 shipyards. By December 1943, 11 Essex-class carriers were operational. By June 1944, that number reached 17, but the cliffhanger remained. As news of American carrier production leaked through Japanese intelligence channels, a young officer named Lieutenant Commander Akira Sasaki had identified what he believed was a fatal flaw in the Essex design: the aviation fuel storage system. Vulnerable to a specific kind of attack. Capable of turning a 27,000-ton carrier into a floating bomb. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa received Sasaki's analysis on March 14, 1944. He authorized planning for the largest carrier ambush in naval history. The target would be the American Fifth Fleet operating near the Mariana Islands. The weapon would be 450 aircraft launched from 9 Japanese carriers. And this was no longer a test. Tokyo's response to the Essex fleet was both brilliant and desperate. Sasaki's analysis identified that American carriers stored aviation gasoline in tanks integrated into the hull structure. A single torpedo strike at the right depth could rupture fuel lines. Vapor would accumulate. One spark would destroy the ship. The plan was called Operation Ago. Vice Admiral Ozawa would lure the American Fifth Fleet into a position where Japanese carrier aircraft, supplemented by land-based bombers from Guam Tinian and Yap, could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Japanese aircraft had longer range than American aircraft. They could strike from 400 miles away. The Americans would have to close the distance, exposing their carriers to massed torpedo attack. Japanese losses had been climbing dangerously since November 1943. At Tarawa, 4 cruisers damaged. At Kwajalein, 3 destroyers sunk. At Truk in February 1944, American carrier strikes destroyed 270 Japanese aircraft, sank 32 ships, and killed 4,500 personnel in a single 48-hour operation. Truk had been Japan's Pearl Harbor of the Pacific. Truk was now a graveyard. Imperial General Headquarters demanded a decisive battle. Casualty rates were unsustainable. Japan was losing 800 aircraft per month against American replacement rates of 2,200 aircraft per month. Pilot training had collapsed from 24 months to 6 months. Veteran flight instructors were being committed to combat units because there were no trained replacements. Ozawa accepted Sasaki's plan because he had no other option. 9 carriers, 450 aircraft. One chance to break the American advance. Japanese intelligence simultaneously launched espionage operations against Newport News and Bethlehem Steel. 3 operatives were caught in May 1944. One was a draftsman who had photographed Essex blueprints for 14 months. The FBI traced his contacts back to the Japanese consulate in Mexico City. But this was not the only threat closing in. A catastrophic problem emerged inside the Essex program itself. On April 30, 1944, USS Franklin, the 18th Essex-class carrier, suffered a hangar deck fire during refueling operations off Norfolk. 3 sailors died. Investigation revealed the fuel line connection on Franklin's modular hangar assembly had been welded by an inexperienced crew at the Newport News Auxiliary Facility. The seam had failed under pressure. Gasoline had sprayed across the hangar deck. A spark from a hand tool had ignited the vapor. The fire was contained within 14 minutes, but the political damage was instant. Vice Admiral Robinson, who had publicly endorsed the program 2 years earlier, faced demands from Congress for a full safety review. Senator Burton Wheeler called for production suspension on all ships not yet launched. Press coverage turned hostile within 48 hours. The Saturday Evening Post ran a feature questioning whether modular construction was safe for combat conditions. Clarence Haggerty was summoned to Norfolk on May 4, 1944. He was now 50 years old. He had supervised welder training at 4 shipyards. He had personally inspected 1,400 hangar deck seams across 11 carriers. He examined the failed weld on Franklin for 90 minutes. His report was blunt. The weld had been performed in March 1944 by a crew working 12-hour shifts. Quality control had been compromised by production pressure. The seam had passed visual inspection, but failed pressure testing because the inspection schedule had been shortened to meet delivery deadlines. Whitfield. Now Captain Whitfield defended Clancy publicly. The Bureau of Construction issued new welding protocols within 11 days. But the doubt had spread. Were the carriers America was sending into combat actually safe? The answer would come 1,400 miles west of Hawaii. But then, a single battle changed everything. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. 0530 hours. Task Force 58 sails in 4 carrier groups across a 25-mile front. 15 carriers. 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 Independence-class light carriers, 956 aircraft, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, 69 destroyers, the largest carrier task force ever assembled. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commands from USS Lexington, the second carrier to bear that name. Below decks, sailors paint over the welded seams Clancy Haggerty's crews had completed 11 months earlier. 8:30 hours. Japanese radar plots appear on American screens. Sasaki's plan is unfolding exactly as designed. Ozawa launches the first strike wave from 380 miles out. 69 aircraft. Zeros valves Jills. The strike turns toward the Americans. Long range. Precisely as planned. But Sasaki's plan has a flaw. American radar detects the strike at 150 miles. Fighter directors aboard Lexington calculate intercept vectors in seconds. 40 Hellcats launch from 3 carriers simultaneously. They climb to 22,000 feet. They wait. The Japanese formation appears beneath them. The Hellcats dive. What happens next has no precedent in carrier warfare. The first pass destroys 25 Japanese aircraft in 90 seconds. The Japanese formation breaks apart. Zeros climb to engage. Hellcats are faster, climb better, and carry 650 caliber machine guns each. American pilots have 300 to 500 hours of training. Japanese pilots have 100 hours. 42 of the 69 attacking aircraft are dead before they see an American ship. The survivors press on. 8 aircraft break through to the carrier groups. They face anti-aircraft fire from 100 ships, using proximity-fused shells, an American invention deployed for the first time in this battle. Proximity fuses detonate near aircraft without requiring direct hits. The kill rate triples. All 8 aircraft are destroyed. 0 hits on American carriers. 856. Ozawa launches the second wave. 109 aircraft. Same tactics. Same range. Same result. American radar detects them. American fighters intercept them. American anti-aircraft guns shred the survivors. 97 of 109 aircraft destroyed. 1,000. Third wave. 47 aircraft. They cannot find the Americans. They turn back, having lost 7 to fighters. 1,001. Fourth wave. 82 aircraft. Slaughter. 73 aircraft destroyed. While Japanese pilots burn and drown across 200 miles of ocean, 2 American submarines move into attack position beneath the surface. USS Albacore detects Vice Admiral Ozawa's flagship Taiho at 09:05. She fires 6 torpedoes from 3,200 yards. 5 miss. 1 strikes Taiho on the starboard bow. The single hit ruptures aviation fuel lines exactly as Sasaki had predicted Essex carriers would suffer. But the carrier hit is Japanese. Taiho's damage control officer makes a fatal mistake. He activates the ventilation system to clear gasoline vapor. The vapor spreads throughout the ship instead of venting overboard. For 6 hours, the carrier floats on a cushion of explosive fumes. 1,532. A spark ignites everything. Taiho explodes from bow to stern. 1,272 men die. Simultaneously, USS Kavala maneuvers into firing position against Shokaku, the carrier that had fought at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz. At 12:20, Kavala fires 6 torpedoes. 3 strike Shokaku amidships. Aviation fuel explodes in the hangar deck. Secondary explosions tear the ship apart. Shokaku sinks at 15:01. 1,263 men die. By sunset, the light carrier Hio is also gone, sunk by aerial torpedoes from USS Belleau Wood. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed in one day. 395 aircraft destroyed. Approximately 380 pilots killed. American losses: 29 aircraft, mostly recovered crews. The exchange ratio is 13:1. American pilots return to their carriers exhausted, low on fuel, having flown the longest carrier strike in history at 300 miles. They land in darkness while Mitcher orders all task force lights illuminated, risking submarine attack to save his pilots. 80 aircraft are recovered safely. Several ditched aircraft yield rescued crews. Aboard USS Lexington, a young pilot named David McCampbell, who had shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in a single sortie, climbs from his Hellcat and vomits over the flight deck. He had been flying combat for 9 hours. He would later destroy 34 Japanese aircraft total, becoming the Navy's leading ace. Mitscher signals Admiral Spruance at 2300 hours. The Japanese mobile fleet is broken. 3 carriers sunk. Aviation power destroyed. Ozawa retreats with 6 carriers and fewer than 100 operational aircraft. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name is cruel but accurate. News of the victory reached Pearl Harbor by midnight on June 19th. By June 21st, every American shipyard knew. By June 25th, the Saturday Evening Post had reversed its editorial position on Essex-class construction. Franklin's hangar fire vanished from headlines. The strategic impact was instantaneous. American forces invaded Saipan, Tinian and Guam with carrier air superiority. B-29 bomber bases established on those islands could now strike Tokyo directly. The Imperial Japanese Navy never again contested American naval operations in open battle. Aircraft carrier production accelerated. USS Hancock, commissioned April 15, 1944. USS Bennington, August 6. USS Boxer, April 16, 1945. By the end of the war, 24 Essex-class carriers were in service or completing construction. 8 more were under construction when Japan surrendered. Japanese aircraft losses reached unsustainable levels. Imperial Navy Aviation, which had begun the war with 3,500 trained pilots, ended 1944 with fewer than 600 combat-capable aviators. Replacement pilots received 40 hours of training before being committed to kamikaze operations because Japan no longer had the fuel or instructors to train them properly. American casualty rates dropped dramatically. The Battle of the Philippine Sea cost 109 American killed and missing. The Battle of Midway 2 years earlier had cost 307 American dead. Carrier warfare had become safer for Americans because Essex-class survivability and overwhelming numbers made each individual ship harder to sink. Production statistics from Newport News alone. Between 1941 and 1945, the shipyard delivered 9 fleet carriers, 11 cruisers, and 73 other warships. Worker count peaked at 31,000. Construction time per Essex hull dropped from 20 months on Essex herself to under 14 months on later ships. Captain Whitfield received the Distinguished Service Medal in October 1944. Rear Admiral Moriel was promoted to Vice Admiral. Clarence Haggerty was awarded the Presidential Medal for Merit in a small ceremony at the White House on November 12, 1944. He attended in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too small. President Roosevelt asked him what he would say to the welders still at work. Clancy answered without hesitation, "Tell them every seam holds 1,000 boys. Make sure they remember which 1,000." The Imperial Japanese Navy was finished as an offensive force. The war would continue for 14 more months, but the outcome was settled. But what happened to the man who started it all? The railroad welder from Roanoke, who walked 62 miles to Newport News with $7 in his pocket. The man whose bare hand on a cold steel seam saved the Essex program on October 14, 1941. The story did not end with the Medal for Merit. It did not end with VJ Day. It did not end at all in the way history books typically describe, because Clarence Haggerty disappeared from public records in 1947. His name vanished from Newport News personnel files. His family received no pension. His daughters were told their father had taken work overseas. For 38 years, no one in the Navy could explain where the man who built America's carrier fleet had actually gone. The truth would not surface until 1985. And what the documents revealed about Clancy's final mission, the Cold War shipyards, and the secret legacy of Essex-class construction would shock historians who thought they understood World War II. Part 4 reveals everything. In Part 1, a railroad welder named Clarence Haggerty walked 62 miles to Newport News with $7 in his pocket. In Part 2, his bare hand on a cold steel seam saved the modular construction program. In Part 3, the Essex-class carriers he helped build crushed the Imperial Japanese Navy at the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944. 3 Japanese carriers sank. 395 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. The war's outcome was settled, but the cliffhanger from Part 3 remained unanswered. Clarence Haggerty disappeared from public records in 1947. His name vanished from Newport News personnel files. His daughters were told their father had taken work overseas. For 38 years, no one in the Navy could explain where the man who built America's carrier fleet had actually gone. The truth would not surface until 1985. And when it did, it revealed that the story of Essex-class construction had a final chapter no historian had ever written. Because success sometimes comes with a price paid in silence. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Clarence Haggerty was 51 years old. He had supervised welding crews across 5 shipyards. He had personally inspected over 2,000 hangar deck seams. He had received the Presidential Medal for Merit. He should have retired to Roanoke, a hero. Instead, in October 1945, he received a sealed envelope from the Bureau of Ships. The letter offered him a position with a classification level he did not understand. The pay was triple his Newport News salary. The location was undisclosed. The duration was open-ended. His wife Edna begged him to refuse. Their daughters, now 17 and 19, wanted their father home. Clancy went anyway. He told Edna it was one more job. He told her he would be back in 18 months. He was gone for 11 years. The fates of the others around him followed different paths. Captain Thomas Whitfield was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1948. He served as Chief of the Bureau of Ships until 1956. He died of heart failure in 1961. His memoir unfinished, the chapters about Haggerty marked, "Do not publish." Vice Admiral Samuel Murray Robinson, the man who had nearly killed the Essex program, retired in 1946. In a 1949 interview with Naval Institute Proceedings, he was asked about modular construction. He answered with 3 words, "I was wrong." He died in 1972 at age 93. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa surrendered Japanese naval forces in September 1945. He testified at war crimes trials, then returned to a small house outside Tokyo. He refused all interviews until 1955. When asked what he thought when he first counted the Essex carriers, he answered, "I thought of my mother. She had once told me a man should know when he is beaten. I knew." Lieutenant Commander Akira Sasaki, the intelligence officer who had identified the supposed flaw in Essex fuel systems, committed suicide on August 16, 1945, the day after Japan surrendered. His final note read, "I calculated correctly. I miscalculated entirely." Edna Haggerty received 12 letters from her husband between 1945 and 1956. They came from postmarks she could not place. Pearl Harbor, San Diego, Norfolk. Other locations censored. She kept every letter in a tin box beneath her bed. But the medals and the absence and the silence were not Clancy's true legacy. The Essex-class program had proven something larger than carriers. It had proven that warships could be mass-produced. That principle reshaped every navy in the world. After 1945, the United States Navy applied modular construction to every major warship class. The Forrestal-class supercarriers, laid down beginning 1952, used prefabricated sections measuring up to 700 tons each. The Nimitz-class nuclear carriers beginning 1968 used modular techniques refined directly from Essex protocols. The current Gerald R. Ford-class carriers are assembled from 161 superlift modules, each pre-outfitted with piping electrical systems and ventilation before installation. The Soviet Union studied captured Essex documents intensively. The Kiev-class aviation cruisers, commissioned in the 1970s, used modular construction methods reverse-engineered from American techniques. China's Type 003 aircraft carrier, launched in 2022, applies the same fundamental approach Clancy Haggerty helped pioneer in 1941. Civilian shipbuilding adopted the methods within a decade. Modern container ships, oil tankers, and cruise liners are all constructed using modular prefabrication. The economic impact runs into trillions of dollars across the global maritime industry. The Essex carriers themselves served far beyond World War II. USS Essex was decommissioned in 1969 after 27 years of service spanning 3 wars. USS Lexington served as a training carrier until 1991, 50 years after her commissioning. USS Intrepid became a museum in New York City in 1982, where over 1 million visitors per year still walk her decks. Total combat record of Essex-class carriers across all conflicts: 24 ships, 11 lost or damaged in combat, 0 sunk by enemy action during World War II. Combined operational service across all hulls exceeded 540 ship years. Aircraft launched from Essex-class flight decks shot down over 7,500 enemy aircraft and sank over 770 enemy vessels during their service lives. In Korea, Essex carriers flew 28,000 combat sorties between 1950 and 1953. In Vietnam, they conducted 92,000 combat missions between 1964 and 1972. Their final combat operations took place in 1975 during the evacuation of Saigon, when USS Hancock evacuated 2,000 American and Vietnamese personnel from the collapsing city. But the largest lesson was not technical. The Essex story is fundamentally about institutions rejecting innovation. About a 47-year-old welder without a high school diploma understanding metal better than men with engineering doctorates. About officials who used regulations to defend their reputations rather than win the war. About one captain who chose to trust evidence over hierarchy. History repeats this pattern endlessly. Billy Mitchell predicted aircraft would sink battleships in 1921. The Navy court-martialed him. He was vindicated at Pearl Harbor in 1941. Hyman Rickover proposed nuclear submarines in 1946. The Navy nearly forced him into retirement. He produced USS Nautilus in 1954. The pattern is the same. Outsiders see possibilities insiders cannot tolerate. Institutions protect themselves before they protect their missions. Innovation comes from people who do not know they are not supposed to succeed. Clarence Haggerty did not know he was not supposed to succeed. He saw cold steel contracting at a measurable rate. He felt a bulkhead frame that needed 40 minutes of heat. He spoke to a Navy commander as if speaking to another welder, because he did not know any other way to speak. Modern military innovation depends on creating space for that kind of knowledge. The Defense Innovation Unit, established in 2015, exists specifically to bring outside expertise into Pentagon decision-making. Every successful military reform of the last century has required someone willing to ignore the people who outranked them. But there is one final detail about Clarence Haggerty that almost no one knows. In 1985, the Navy declassified records related to the Cold War shipbuilding program. The documents revealed that between 1946 and 1956, the United States Navy maintained a classified facility at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. The facility's purpose was to develop modular construction techniques for nuclear-powered warships. The lead consultant on welding protocols was identified by the codename Roanoke. For 30 years, Roanoke trained the welders who built the first nuclear submarines, including USS Nautilus, USS Skate, and USS Polaris-class ballistic missile submarines. Roanoke was Clarence Haggerty. He had been recruited in October 1945 because his expertise was considered too valuable to risk in civilian employment, where Soviet intelligence might reach him. He spent 11 years training welders for nuclear submarine programs. He retired in 1956. He returned to Roanoke. He never spoke about the work. His daughters learned the truth only after his death in 1971. The Navy released a sealed letter Clancy had written in 1962 to be delivered when he died. The letter contained 4 sentences. "Tell your mother I never lied about why I was gone. The work mattered more than I could say. Every seam still holds 1,000 boys. I built ships that kept them home." Edna Haggerty had passed away in 1968. She never read the letter. The tin box beneath her bed contained 12 envelopes, all opened, all read repeatedly across 23 years of waiting. From a railroad welder with $7 and a borrowed suit, to the man whose welding standards built the carriers that won World War II, and the submarines that deterred a Third World War. Clarence Haggerty proved that genius does not require credentials, that institutions are wrong more often than they admit, and that the most decisive contributions to history are sometimes made by people no one ever sees. 24 Essex-class carriers, over 1,000 modern warships built using the techniques he helped develop. An estimated 3.4 million Americans who served aboard ships constructed with modular methods between 1942 and 2025. Countless lives saved because welded seams held when men's lives depended on them. That is the power of one ordinary man choosing to trust what his hands knew when the world told him to be quiet. If you know a story like this, an unsung figure whose work changed history, share it in the comments below. Stories like Clancy's deserve to be told. They remind us that the people who change the world rarely look like the people history remembers. This was just one of hundreds of impossible innovations from World War II. From radar to penicillin, from jeeps to jet engines, the war was won as much in workshops and laboratories as on battlefields. Subscribe to our channel to discover more of these forgotten stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. And let us know in the comments which conflict you would like us to explore next. Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on the cruiser Haguro on June 19, 1944, watching his flagship burn, and understood that he had been beaten by something he could not see. He thought it was American industry. He was partly right. But the deeper truth was a 50-year-old welder kneeling on a cold steel deck in Virginia 3 years earlier, who had pulled off his glove and trusted what his bare hand knew about contracting metal. Wars are won by armies, but armies are built by people. And the most important people are usually the ones whose names are never carved into monuments. Clarence "Clancy" Haggerty has no monument. He has no biography. His grave in Roanoke, Virginia, bears only his name, his dates, and 4 words he requested before he died. He held the seam. He held the seam. The seam held the deck. The deck held the aircraft. The aircraft won the war. That is the chain of history. That is the power of ordinary courage applied with extraordinary skill. That is why one welder mattered more than 20 admirals, and that is why this story almost lost to time deserved to be told. Asterisk.